Hello, everybody. My name's Peter Bonnell. I'm the Senior Curator at QUAD. Welcome to today's latest exhibition exploration here at QUAD, looking back at our archives, or in this case, an exhibition that was on at QUAD when the lockdown started. So if you're watching this and the pandemic's still on, this exhibition was on at QUAD. It was supposed to last to the 5th of April and the 29th of February. And it's Dryden Goodwin alongside, featuring a fantastic film work and a series of Dryden's beautifully made drawings. Just like to say a huge thanks to V21 Art Space for producing this 3D exhibition tour that we're going to use today. Today I'm joined by the artist Dryden Goodwin. Hi Dryden.
Hi Peter, hi there.
And I'm also joined by Gary Thomas, the co-director of Animate Projects. And this project was a co-commission with Animate Projects as part of the major Midlands-based work programme, working with a range of artists and organisations. And I'm going to go straight to Gary Thomas to say a few words about work. So hi Gary, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks Peter. Hi Dryden.
Hi,
Animate, we work with artists and experimental animators to make films, and Dryden's film alongside is one of 4 films we commissioning alongside with QUAD, and working with 3 other organisations around the Midlands. They were Firmin Woods, Junction Arts, and Vivid Projects, and with each partner, we worked with an artist to support artists to make films about aspects of contemporary work in particular contexts. And the context for Dryden and Derby, we wanted that to be sort of healthcare. And in particular, Dryden's, we did an open call, and Dryden sent a really kind of perfect proposal for us, wanting to look at individual healthcare workers. And working with QUAD for Derby, we asked people to send in proposals for healthcare contexts. And Dryden's proposal was great. The project developed as he explored things more, but from the very beginning, what grabbed us about it was the very human engagement that Dryden wanted to explore between him as an artist and breaking down the line, I think, between an artist documenting someone's life and engaging with that person as their life is documented. And the film is extraordinary in the way, in both how intimate it is, but in the way, I think, how the form of the film and having Paul Johnston, the care worker, feature so strongly, and having his voice. One of the things we said that the work programme wanted to achieve was to give voice to voices that aren't often heard, and that's what Alongside does. The name Alongside as well is really great for all 4 films, very much about artists working side by side with the people they're making films about.
Thank you so much, Gary, for that introduction to the work project. I should say as well that this project was part of QUAD's collab season. We had an exhibition by an artist called Anna Bunting Branch in Gallery 1. And the idea of collab is to work literally in collaboration with other organisations and artists and practitioners to make new work. So working with Animate, again, which we have a long-standing relationship between QUAD and Animate, again, we produced another, I think, a fabulous project, a great new commission, and a great way to reflect, particularly in these times of pandemic, on the awful things that are happening in our hospitals and our care homes and with caregivers, and the great work that they do and the work that people like Paul Johnston do, giving those young men who are featured in the film, and Dryden will talk at great length about this, who are giving them a lifeline to the outside world. So without further ado, Dryden, shall we head into the exhibition space? Moving to QUAD's Gallery 2, past the vitrine with your wonderful drawings in it. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. And we're going to go direct into the screening room here.
Great.
Gary's already done us a great introduction. Could you talk a bit about the genesis of the film, Dryden, how you engaged with your subject, in essence, Paul Johnston, and what the film meant to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, Alongside, it's 24-minute film, and it's a closely observed study of a care worker, and I'm documenting as he builds supportive relationships with 3 young men that he's working with, and each of the young men have severe physical disabilities or autism, and the need to observe and decipher and translate. That's also mirrored in my process of making the film, and I combine drawing and camera and sound. And the film, I suppose, becomes an inquiry into proximity and empathy. And throughout the 24 minutes, I document the rhythms of the day that Paul spends individually with each of the people that he's working with, and I focus on the details and points of contact between Paul and each young man that he's working with. He's working with Jack, David, and Rob. I'm looking very much at how Paul navigates and enables them, each young man, to access the world beyond the daycare centre. And then peppered throughout the whole film are Paul's reflections on the nature of his interactions and his profound responsibilities and drives, and how over time he finds ways to decode his clients' needs to understand their anxieties and motivations.
Alongside this talk, we'll have links to the film, your website as well, and other links to engage people with the exhibition. And as we're talking now, we'll be showing stills from the film as well, which will give you an idea of that very intimate way in which you document Paul in that fluorescent yellow jacket that almost became his uniform or his standout in the film, alongside the young men he was helping. For example, the young man in the wheelchair. And I remember you telling us the story that the young man in the wheelchair pressing the button for the lift. And in fact, Paul talks about it, doesn't he, in the film? And just those very brief, simple moments are just so mind-blowing about what we take for granted ourselves. But this young man in the chair, he found it difficult to reach for the button, but it's such a sense of achievement. And what Paul does is just simply give him the space and the time to do it.
Being alongside Paul as he's alongside the young men, you become very aware that he's tuning in a very specific way to how he can help them. And due to the sort of neurodiversity of the young men that he's working with, each of them have very specific needs, and Paul finds a way of tuning into how he can best support them. And I think that's kind of was really fascinating to see, Paul, that this very nuanced and detailed way of carefully and over time tuning in to their individual frequencies and a sense of things that motivate them and anxieties they may have, or how best he can support that. So that sense of how he can adapt his behavior and the way that he is to best suit them was a really kind of profound part of observing and documenting Paul at work. And this sense of, I suppose, of observing and perception, that those ideas have come up in lots of different ways. There's Paul's way of reading the situation, but there's also mine in terms of how I'm documenting and recording that. And there's also the young men that he's working with. And there's these sort of questions about how it's possible to attempt to understand and empathize with others, and there's something kind of really fascinating to me in that, and this sort of mirroring that's going on, where Paul in a way is studying the young men to try to get under the surface and try to both respond to what you're seeing, but also what he's not seeing, to try to interpret and to try to fill in gaps of what he might not be able to directly ask the individuals that he's working with. And in some way, I kind of realized that that's what I was doing, that I'm observing Paul and I'm trying to sort of decode his processes and his ways of relating to the world and relating to the work that he's doing, and then to find a way through my use of the camera and through drawing to try to document it, to find some way of translating that into another form.
It's intriguing, of course, as you say, about how you went about not only documenting someone at work, and the young men are very much subjects of the film too. But those of us who know Paul Johnson know him as a deeply decent, caring individual. He comes across as such a likeable man, and that way in which you got that across, the simple act of when he cuts up and mashes up the food for the young man in a wheelchair, for example. I also recall that one of the standout moments for me is when Paul would whistle or sing, and he used that in a way to engage with another of the young men. For example, we may have seen earlier the young man with the headphones on, and I think he had that sort of a sing-song voice or a sing-song way of approaching the world. And I think those very small vignettes of what Paul does to interact and engage with young men and to give them that bridge to the outside and wider world is comes across in such incredibly beautiful and as I say, intimate ways.
What became really clear to me looking at Paul was this sense Well, he describes in the film, the first words that he says in the film, he says that it's all in the looking, it's all in the observing, so you can just build a bigger picture of the person. And there was something about this attention to the details and to observing over time, this kind of incremental building up of a picture, and that the importance of patience, the sense of the need to slow right down that he suggested in everything that he was doing, to take your time, and the sense that the world is a hard place to negotiate. And of course that's emphasized when we see the young men and the need for Paul to support them in what they're doing. But this sort of sense of patience, having this extraordinary patience, took on a kind of profundity, I think, in the film, and how that in itself becomes sort of transformative, and how for the young men their anxieties in different ways can come to the surface in a very quick way, and how this sort of sense of Paul as this ever supporting navigator.
Should we talk now? I'm always been fascinated with your practice about the drawings and how you're able to both use them as standalone artworks, of course, but incorporate them as integral parts of the films that you make. Can you explain a little bit about what the drawings mean to you? What do they do for you as part of the sense of looking?
So interesting what you're saying about drawing as an act. In a way, I think the drawing became a kind of blueprint for the film. There was this sense of, with a drawing, it's as much about what you don't see as what you do see, and this sense of how the imagination has to leap across the gaps within the drawing. And that sense, I think, carries on to the approach to the whole film, that I didn't want to reveal the whole picture at any one point. The language of the camera is, I'm filming from oblique angles or from behind, or I made very swift diagrammatic drawings and sometimes more tonally worked up drawings. This sense of shifting between what I was seeing but also what I was feeling. And I'm interested in how holding back become triggers to involve the viewer, and a sense that they also are alongside, accompanying on this journey. I suppose with a drawing, you put a mark down on a piece of paper to start a drawing, and then it becomes a series of relationships between different points on a flat page. But of course, you're negotiating both a three-dimensional space, but also a four-dimensional space. It's kind of, you're moving through time. I'm doing it directly in observation. It's on the fly. It feels like a notepad, and I'm kind of scribbling down, having to work really fast and having to be very responsive and very nimble, as Paul is too. To a changing situation, Paul has to respond in the moment and has to be kind of hyper aware. And I think that need to be attentive, I think, became very clear for me too within my processes. Obviously there's very different things at stake within my processes, but I was really interested in that kind of relationship between, always being in a state of trying to translate and decipher what's in front of you. So those sort of fragmentary marks that you're seeing in the drawings, how they might accumulate, and this sort of sense of this incomplete cohesion that you get, in the drawings, and how that really becomes important for the kind of leaps of imagination that I'm making, but also that everybody involved in the film is too, and hopefully the viewer is doing too.
Watching you draw as well, and as it goes through almost stages at times, particularly, for example, when you're with Paul and the young men at the swimming pool, if I can find it.
Yes.
And it's like you're trying to lock in that sense of the moment. Of course you are, but that sense of what Paul is doing at that point, trying to capture that essence of it. And it's all well and good with a really great film with moving image, but the very act of you, as you say, building up those marks, it just gives a sense of you coming to grips with who this is as a person, and that sense of moment, and what that very act of, for example, just helping them be able to swim, to the freedom of exercise, the freedom of being in a pool with other people. It comes across so very, very, again, very intimate, very evocative in these images. Even the images of Paul's eyes, and again, if you know Paul, these are he has very distinctive eyes as well. But you're digging into the essence of who these people are through the drawings, of which I think even Spielberg could never do with a camera lens. What you can do with a pencil And that sense of emotion on the page is in your work is awesome to watch, really. And the construction of the image too, is it seems to sort of appear from the depths of the paper is remarkable.
I really like what you were saying about building the image, and I kind of feel that there's a sense to the sort of diagrammatic within the whole film. You know, you're just seeing little details, and then somehow the viewer builds this more complete picture in their imagination. There's something that seems very important to me about the oscillation between working with the camera lens, where you might be looking at things more directly and at people and at spaces, but then picking up a piece of paper and a pencil, and then you're sitting in it's a very different sort of lens. You're sitting and you're looking back and forward. The sense of the translation is more explicit at the point of making the drawing, and somehow you're very conscious of the difference between what you're seeing and what you're managing to get down. There's a space there that you're trying to collapse, both in terms of representation, but also in terms of how you connect to someone who's at a distance from you, or even if they're directly in front of you. And there's something about the idea of a drawn mark kind of reaching out across space, and then you're pulling that space back to the page, and then carefully building an image. And this, I like this idea that as you're attempting to render something or someone or somewhere that you're seeing, you're trying to do this, but the drawing then becomes a remnant of all these misses that you have, but somehow cumulatively there's something that's held on the page. And of course, it's never the person themselves. It's a representation, but not just of them, but also of the time spent looking and engaging. And to me, there's a value within time spent focused on other people and trying to work out other people. It might be the way they look, but it might also be the way they think. And I think that for me, there's something within that very much so, also within Paul's work. There's something deeply moving to me to do that and to connect, and the relationships that he builds between himself and the young men. And I suppose in a way, making the film is a way of, when you draw someone and you're trying to translate an experience, in a way, for that time you almost have a sense, you almost become that person, almost you have a hyper sense of that person. That to me was so interesting in what Paul was doing, that he had to do that to be really most effective and most connected in his work.
You wanted to, with this film, to shadow caregivers, to the healthcare professionals, and to try and get to the essence of their day-to-day activities and what they do. And Paul himself talks a little bit about cuts and maybe some political elements later on. And then I think that's very, very much needed in this climate, but gives you a sense, particularly during the pandemic, of how we come to rely on these great people like Paul and the work that he does. I think we'll wrap it up there, because that is such a short whistle-stop overview of Alongside, but incredibly rich explanations of content that I think you've given us there. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to close then by saying thanks to our continuing funders, Arts Council England, to Derby City Council too, to our partners, Animate Projects, and all the partners in the project that Gary Thomas has mentioned, and Jerwood Arts, who kindly funded a huge amount of this project, as well as Arts Council England too. Gary Thomas, thank you so much for being able to join us earlier in this talk. And also thanks to Jane Hardstaff, our Creative Wellbeing Officer at QUAD, who put you in touch with Paul. And I'd like to close by saying to everyone, if you're watching this during the pandemic, stay safe and well. And to Dryden Goodwin, we have been talking about working together for a number of years, and we finally got to do it. And then this pandemic curtailed the exhibition. But that doesn't stop the fact that we've got to work with you on a fabulous exhibition with these great images, a great film work that will always be there. And I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Dryden. Thank you for taking part in this talk today.
Thank you, Peter. And no, it was an absolute pleasure working with you on the exhibition. And also a big thanks to Gary, and of course to Paul Johnstone, and also the young men and their families, and the staff at Community Links in Derby, who are so supportive and generous when I was working on the project.